Hey guys, tonight we step into a dim corridor that smells faintly of beeswax, old silk, and decisions no one ever wrote down. You move slowly, your hand drifting along cool stone walls polished by generations of queens, daughters, and ladies in waiting who walked here long before you. Their stories cling to the air like dust in candlelight stories of quiet negotiations, whispered commands, and choices made behind tapestries while the world believed the king decided everything. You breathe in, and the palace exhales right back at you, as if reminding you that nothing in these halls is ever as simple as it looks. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the soft clink of metal from an armored guard shifting his weight. Even that sound is a reminder. You're being watched. Royal women always were. Their movements tracked, their words weighed, their glances judged. In a world where the wrong smile could start a rumor and the wrong silence could start a war, survival wasn't about strength, it was about reading a room before you even walked into it. And yes, you probably wouldn't survive this place for 24 hours. But hey, it makes great bedtime history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing those little time zone check-ins. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step deeper into the palace corridor, holding onto the warm hum of candlelight as shadows ripple across your path. In these early moments, you're learning your first and most important rule of royal womanhood. The walls always listen, but they never speak, which is probably why historians still argue whether certain queens truly masterminded political coups or were just very good at being accidentally nearby when things happened. Convenient positions tend to become suspicious positions when men write the records. A mainstream fact lands softly in your mind. In many medieval and early modern courts, royal women had official titles. But unofficial expectations, be beautiful, be obedient, produce heirs, don't cause trouble, and please pretend you enjoy wearing 10 pounds of jewelry shaped like tiny instruments of neck pain. Queens could technically advise kings, but only if the king wanted to be advised, which, spoiler, was not a universal trait. You move past a carved door showing a scene of angels hovering over a crowned woman. It looks peaceful. But the irony hits you. Royal women were often portrayed as serene symbols, precisely because real serenity was nearly impossible. Inside palaces, emotions were currency, and the value of a queen's smile could rise or fall faster than a cryptocurrency chart. A fringe tidbit flickers into your thoughts. Some royal courts kept astrologers, specialized in advising queens on which days were safest for conversation, persuasion, or even hair-washing rituals that supposedly influenced political outcomes. Imagine being told, "Don't negotiate peace until after Thursday." Mercury's being dramatic again. Honestly, it sounds like half of modern workplace culture. You continue walking and feel the weight of 1,000 unseen expectations settle onto your shoulders. Every silk rustle echoes with pressure. Behave like a saint, think like a diplomat, endure like a marble statue. But the joke, floating lightly in your head like a mischievous breeze, is that saints rarely survive royal courts. Only strategists do. One more reminder that being graceful was code for please navigate 17 layers of danger without complaining. As you pass a narrow window, moonlight cuts across the floor, and for a moment, you imagine a young royal woman centuries ago standing exactly where you are, wondering whether she's safe or whether her smile tomorrow morning will decide her entire fate. She practiced survival through subtleties, folded hands, lowered eyelids, a tilt of the head that said, "I am harmless," even when she definitely wasn't. The palace hums, warm and heavy, like the final minutes before sleep pulls you under. But there's still one more insight waiting for you in these early shadows. Royal women weren't merely ornaments. They were observers, collectors of whispers, decoders of glances. Their world was a chessboard, where they often started 2 moves behind, but still found ways to win without anyone realizing a game was happening. A second light joke bubbles up quietly. You wonder how many crises in history could have been avoided if kings just asked their wives, "Does this political alliance look stupid to you?" Probably a lot. But then again, if kings had listened more, we wouldn't have nearly as many dramatic bedtime stories. You step into a small alcove where a half-burnt candle trembles. The flame dances, almost as if bowing to you, welcoming you into the secret rhythm of royal womanhood. Patience mixed with paranoia, elegance mixed with exhaustion, sweetness mixed with steel. Historians still argue whether some queens' diaries truly reflected their inner thoughts, or whether they simply wrote what they hoped posterity would believe. After all, if someone might read your journal centuries later, you'd probably edit out the bad days too. A final fringe sensation settles around you. Some palaces required ladies in waiting to sleep in chambers right outside the queen's bedroom, not to protect her, but to monitor her. Imagine having a 24-hour surveillance team of politely gossiping roommates. Medieval privacy deserved hazard pay. And as you stand there, listening to the soft crackle of wax and stone breathing together, you understand the quiet thesis of royal life. The crown weighed the heaviest on those who never got to wear it. You move from the candlelit alcove into a wider hall where the ceiling arches overhead like the ribcage of some ancient beast. Each step echoes, long and hollow, as if the stones themselves are remembering every royal daughter who ever passed through on her way to a future she didn't choose. Tonight, you follow in those footsteps not as a queen, not even as a princess, but simply as someone peeking behind the embroidered curtain of royal expectation. A thin draught curls around your ankles, carrying the faint scent of lavender, parchment, and ink. It's the smell of arranged destinies. Because here, in these upper corridors, daughters were promised almost before they had names, before birth, even signed away like diplomatic storm clouds with tiny beating hearts. You pause by a sliver of stained glass depicting a queen cradling a newborn daughter. The baby's wrapped in gold thread blankets, but the mother's face, well, her expression looks like someone told her her newborn already has a to-do list. And honestly, she's not wrong. A mainstream fact hums in your ears. Throughout medieval and early modern Europe, royal daughters were essentially political paperwork, living treaties, human alliances, emotional debts sealed in lace. While sons were groomed for crowns, daughters were groomed for contracts. You imagine the scene. A royal council meeting before the child is even born. Advisors pacing, debating, predicting the baby's gender like anxious gamblers. If it's a girl, we could offer her to the Duke of so-and-so in exchange for peace. They say this while the mother is upstairs, still trying to keep down her morning porridge. Pregnancies weren't just biological, they were geopolitical negotiations in progress. You walk past an open doorway into a nursery long abandoned. Dust dances lazily in the air, glowing orange in the candlelight. Tiny carved cradles sit against the wall, their sides decorated with animals, stars, and vines. The sweetness of the room is almost heartbreaking when you consider that many royal girls grew up knowing they belonged more to their father's counsel than to their own childhood. Historians still argue whether some princesses were genuinely happy with their arranged fate or simply mastered the art of looking serene in portraits. Given the era's painting techniques, serene might just mean, "I've been standing still for 7 hours. Please help." A fringe tidbit floats into your mind. In some courts, midwives whispered predictions about newborn girls' future husbands while cutting the umbilical cord. Imagine entering the world and immediately being told, "Congratulations, tiny human. You're betrothed to a 14-year-old with questionable grooming habits and a kingdom 2 boat rides away." You step deeper into the room, letting your fingers trail across a small wooden toy discarded centuries ago. A round little horse missing one wheel. You wonder how many royal girls sat here, daydreaming, of lives they'd never live, lives where they could choose their own friends, choose their own path, maybe even choose not to marry a stranger whose portrait made him look vaguely like a disgruntled ferret. A soft joke rises gently. Honestly, royal matchmaking back then wasn't far from modern dating apps. Swipe left, swipe right, except your father does the swiping, and the stakes are continental war. A window overlooking the palace garden offers a moment of calm. The moonlight spills over roses, fountains, and hedge mazes shaped like crowns. It's beautiful, but you sense the tension braided into it. These gardens weren't just for strolling, they were stage sets for political theatre. Princesses were paraded here before foreign ambassadors to be admired, which is code for evaluated for usefulness. Think of it as the medieval version of LinkedIn, but with more embroidery. Your steps carry you down a quieter corridor where tapestries hang heavy and thick. One shows a young princess boarding a ship. Her face is hopeful, but the water behind her churns violently. You can almost hear the waves slapping the hull, the seagulls crying, the distant shouts of sailors preparing to take her away from everything she knew. Many royal daughters travelled across continents to marry men whose language, customs, and favorite foods were utter mysteries. Some adapted beautifully, others not so much. Still, royal daughters learned young that their feelings didn't matter nearly as much as their usefulness. You picture a 10-year-old princess being told she must smile during treaty dinners, sit straight, and remember which fork signals friendliness to visiting ambassadors. Meanwhile, 10-year-old you probably struggled to remember which TV remote button actually turned on the TV. Historians still argue whether royal mothers truly supported these strategic marriages or secretly hated watching their daughters disappear into political arrangements. Some diaries hint at heartbreak. Others suggest pride. Most suggest that, much like today, families had complicated feelings that no royal decree could simplify. You move toward a staircase carved with curling vines. Each step creaks softly, like old voices murmuring beneath your feet. You can almost sense the presence of young princesses carrying their futures in their posture. Dresses too heavy, hearts even heavier. Yet beneath that sadness, another truth glimmers. Some royal daughters became fierce negotiators, powerful queens, or cultural influencers in their new lands. Their marriages weren't always the end of their freedom. Sometimes they were the beginning of their strategy. A fringe tidbit nudges your curiosity. A few royal girls were betrothed multiple times before age 6 because alliances kept shifting. Imagine being engaged, unengaged, re-engaged, and reassigned all before losing your first baby tooth. Your relationship status page would look like political fan fiction. You step into a balcony alcove where the night air wraps around you like a cool shawl. Below, the palace glows with torchlight. Somewhere inside those warm-lit rooms, centuries ago, a newborn princess slept under silk blankets, unaware that her future had already been mailed out like a diplomatic RSVP. One more soft joke drifts lazily in your mind. Royal fathers treated daughters like human gift cards, redeemable, transferable, and occasionally re-gifted when alliances changed. You lean against the stone railing, feeling the weight of all those stories. Every royal daughter began as a child with a tiny heartbeat and a world of possibilities, until politics narrowed those possibilities to a single path. Yet many of those girls found ways to survive, adapt, and even thrive within the gilded cage. Their resilience is the quiet heartbeat behind every candle flickering in this palace tonight. And as the wind ruffles your hair, you sense the first stirring of the next chapter, marriage, duty, and a life none of them chose, waiting just beyond the horizon. You descend from the moonlit balcony, following a soft corridor that curves like a river bending toward fate. The air grows warmer here, heavier too, with the scent of rose oil and expectation. You don't know it yet, but you're drifting straight into the uneasy heart of royal marriage, the kind where wedding nights are less about romance and more about paperwork, surveillance, and two households hoping the couple will get along long enough to produce an heir. Your footsteps carry you past a row of narrow doors, each leading to chambers where brides prepared themselves under the eyes of half a dozen attendants. Imagine trying to get ready for the biggest political event of your life, while strangers argue over how shiny your forehead should be. A mainstream fact slips in quietly. Royal brides were often coached for weeks, sometimes months, on how to behave on their wedding night. What to say, what not to say, how to appear modest without seeming fearful, and how to avoid doing anything that could be interpreted as unseemly, which included everything. You pause at an embroidered tapestry showing a bride walking down an aisle, her face calm but her hands white-knuckled. The groom stands stiff-backed at the altar, surrounded by advisors wearing expressions that scream, "Please don't ruin this alliance for us." The whole scene feels strangely familiar, like the medieval version of two families performing politeness while secretly hoping no one mentions the dowry. Historians still argue whether many royal couples experienced even a hint of affection on their wedding nights, or whether everything remained strictly functional. Functional being the polite, sleep-friendly term for a deeply awkward experience supervised by politics. And yes, supervised is the right word. In some courts, witnesses were required to stand outside the wedding chamber door, just in case. You can't help but imagine those attendants playing cards, sipping cider, and whispering, "So how long do we wait before we knock?" A fringe tidbit glimmers mischievously. Some royal families gifted newlyweds with fertility charms, including embroidered pillows decorated with symbols you definitely wouldn't show in a family-friendly textbook. Let's just say medieval embroidered art got surprisingly creative, and leave it at that. You continue down the corridor, the torchlight flickering across portraits of queens whose marriages were more battlefield than honeymoon. One queen's eyes seemed to follow you, a subtle warning in their painted sheen. She married at 14 to a man she'd met twice. Her dowry could have built 3 villages. Her husband barely spoke to her unless advisors were present. Romantic, right? And you thought modern dating involved mixed signals. Your steps guide you into a quieter alcove. A small bench sits beneath a carved wooden canopy, worn down by centuries of anxious brides waiting to be called into their wedding feasts. You sit for a moment and imagine the tremble in their hands, the rehearsed smiles, the inner pep talk that probably sounded something like, "Okay, don't trip, don't cry, don't look terrified, don't insult your new kingdom's cuisine, and definitely don't bring up that rumor about your groom's weird hobby." A soft joke floats to the surface. Royal brides often receive pages of instructions on how to behave, but somehow no one ever wrote a guide titled, "So your husband might be a tyrant, here's plan B." That would have been helpful. The palace shifts around you, the floor slightly sloping toward another hall, where musicians once played slow, echoing melodies during wedding banquets. You pass by a faded fresco of dancers twirling in heavy brocade. The bride is shown smiling, though historians still argue whether she truly smiled that night or whether the artist simply painted the to expression her kingdom needed her to have. You pause at a door slightly ajar. Inside, an ancient canopy bed sits beneath layers of draped silk. The mattress bows in the center from hundreds of years of gravity, along with who knows how many royal couples trying to navigate the world's most uncomfortable first meeting. The sheets are threadbare now, embroidered patterns nearly erased, but you can almost hear the whisper of nervous breaths from centuries ago. A mainstream fact settles smoothly. In some royal courts, a marriage wasn't considered legitimate until the groom formally declared consummation the next morning. Sometimes in front of witnesses, sometimes with proof, sometimes with awkwardly cheerful announcements that sounded like medieval morning after tweets. You're grateful you live in a time when privacy is at least theoretically real. But beneath the jokes and the political stiffness, you sense a deeper truth. Royal wives often walked into marriages with no clue whether their new husband would be kind, indifferent, cruel, or simply absent. And yet, they were expected to adapt instantly to learn new languages, new customs, new loyalties, and new ways of surviving a home that wasn't theirs. You run your fingers along the carved post of the canopy bed. The wood is smooth from centuries of hands, some trembling, some steady, some resigned, some quietly determined. These walls absorbed everything: whispered fears, forced small talk, the long silence between two people who barely knew each other. A curious fringe note whispers in your ear. Some royal brides carried miniature portraits of their grooms sewn into their sleeves in case they forgot what he looked like. Considering medieval artists sometimes made everyone look like elongated potatoes, you can imagine the confusion. You step away from the bed, letting the room fade behind you as you move back into the hall. Another carved door waits ahead, slightly cracked, as if inviting you. Toward the next chapter of royal womanhood, the unspoken power, the subtle negotiations, the constant balancing act between fragility and strategy. Marriage was only the beginning. What came next required something far rarer than beauty or obedience. It required a queen to wield influence in a place that insisted she had none. And that's where you're heading now. You move into a narrower passage where the walls seem to lean inward, as if the palace itself is lowering its voice. The air here feels different, quieter, heavier, with the unspoken truth royal women lived by. You don't need a crown to shape a kingdom. You just need to understand the spaces between words, the pauses between orders, the expressions men make when they think no one is watching. This is where queens without official power learn to rule anyway, softly, invisibly, masterfully. A servant scurries past you, barely glancing up. You realize how often queens were overlooked like this, dismissed as decorative flourishes in a world of swords and councils. It's almost funny, considering those same decorative flourishes sometimes swayed more decisions through a raised eyebrow than an entire cabinet could through hours of debate. One mainstream fact glimmers gently. In many European courts, queens were legally barred from direct political authority, no leading armies, no voting in councils, no official commands. Yet kings routinely relied on them for advice, emotional grounding, and diplomatic finesse. The irony is thick enough to spread on toast. You follow the corridor into a warm, candlelit sitting room where letters lie stacked neatly on a carved table. Royal women mastered the art of correspondence like warriors mastering their blades. Letters were their weapons, ink sharper than steel, metaphors more explosive than gunpowder. A single, carefully phrased note could soothe tempers, shift alliances, or politely destroy someone's reputation without ever sounding impolite. If queens had LinkedIn profiles, they'd all be endorsed for strategic influence and diplomatic subtlety. You pick up one sealed letter. The wax isn't real wax anymore, just brittle remnants, but you imagine the queen who wrote it dipping her quill, pausing to consider how to phrase a suggestion so gently that the king would believe the idea was his. Historians still argue whether some royal policies were actually the brainchildren of queens, whose brilliance was hidden behind social rules that forced them to pretend they were just offering thoughts or little notions. You drift toward a velvet upholstered chair where a queen might have sat while listening to court gossip from her ladies-in-waiting. Royal women didn't just overhear secrets, they collected them like rare coins. Information is leverage. Their tutors never said out loud, but absolutely meant. With a single whisper shared at the right moment, a queen could redirect an entire council debate. A subtle compliment might win loyalty. A subtle omission might doom a rival's ambitions. A soft joke floats in. Imagine how deadly these queens would have been with modern group chats. Half the continent would have been running on "per my last message" energy. You continue walking, your fingers gliding across a long table covered with perfumed oils and polished bronze mirrors. These weren't vanity tools, they were instruments of political presence. A queen who appeared calm, radiant, and unruffled communicated strength without saying a word. Beauty itself became political currency, even if no one admitted it out loud. You picture a queen practicing a perfectly neutral smile in the mirror, one that said, "I support you, my dear king," while secretly meaning, "I'm about to fix your terrible decision later tonight." A fringe tidbit pokes your curiosity. Some queens learned coded fan language, yes, literal handheld fans to communicate private messages in public. One flick opened negotiations, one tilt signaled annoyance, one slow wave conveyed, "Stop talking, dear, you're embarrassing us diplomatically." If emojis existed then, queens would have invented them. You step through a lace-curtained doorway into the queen's private audience room. This is where she received visitors, the hopeful, the desperate, the clever, the doomed. You imagine the hum of anxious voices filling the space, each person hoping the queen might whisper a word in the king's ear. She listened patiently, appearing serene while her mind sprinted like a diplomat in a foot race. Not every queen used her influence wisely, of course. Some manipulated out of fear, loneliness, or ambition. Others miscalculated spectacularly, like one queen who accidentally sparked a succession crisis by trying to secure a small favor for a cousin. Historians still argue whether she misunderstood the political climate or whether her rivals exaggerated her role for convenience. Either way, the poor woman probably spent the rest of her life thinking, "I should have stayed out of that conversation." You pass a long tapestry depicting a queen sitting beside her king during a council meeting. Officially, she's just there to look supportive. Unofficially, those queens often nudged fate with a single sentence murmured under their breath. "Perhaps another approach," they'd say softly, which in royal wife language meant, "Your idea is terrible, and I'm saving us all." The tapestry's colours have faded, but the message is still loud. Presence itself is power. You move toward a tall window overlooking the courtyard. Down below, soldiers train, diplomats argue, couriers rush in and out. All visible power happens out there, under the open sky. But the hidden power, the matchmaking, the whisper networks, the subtle corrections to royal policy happened up here, behind gauzy curtains. And the queens orchestrated it all, while pretending they were merely hosting tea. Another gentle joke. Queens basically invented multitasking, smiling politely, while calculating which noble family needed appeasing, and which needed gentle discouragement. A cool breeze slips through the cracks as you walk into a dim reading alcove. Shelves line the walls, filled with books and scrolls copied painstakingly by scribes. Queens weren't always allowed direct political education, but many taught themselves. Some learned statecraft by reading histories. Others used religious texts to justify advice. A few quietly studied foreign languages so they could correspond without translators snooping. A fringe fact brushes your ear. One French queen was rumoured to hide political instructions inside her embroidery patterns. Whether true or not, it proves one thing. Never underestimate a woman holding a needle. You let your hand rest on a carved wooden balustrade, feeling the centuries breathing around you. Queens without authority still shaped kingdoms, not through decrees or swords, but through attention, intelligence, and tiny, precise shifts in the palace's emotional gravity. You sense the next corridor calling you forward, the world of rivals and mistresses, where queens fought shadow battles not with violence but with the sharp, silent elegance of survival. You slip from the quiet alcove into a hallway that feels sharper, somehow colder, more perfumed, more dangerous. This is the territory of courtly rivalries, where every smile hides a strategy and every embroidered sleeve conceals a tiny dagger made of gossip. You can almost hear the rustle of silk skirts and the soft tap-tap of jeweled shoes as mistresses, queens, ladies-in-waiting, and ambitious noblewomen move through the palace like pieces on an endlessly complicated chessboard. The lighting here is warm, flattering on purpose. Courts were built to make beauty look like a political asset, because in many ways, it was. Royal mistresses weren't just women who caught a king's eye. They were influence brokers, rumor engines, rivals to queens, and sometimes the only people the king actually listened to. A mainstream fact whispers through your thoughts. In several European courts, especially France, England, and certain Italian states, the king's official mistress held a recognized position, complete with apartments, servants, and political sway that sometimes eclipsed the queen's. Imagine being legally married to the man and still having to tiptoe around the woman he prefers to talk to. That's not a marriage, that's a long-term group project with bad communication. You walk farther down the hall until you reach a gilded mirror, tall and warped by age. Its surface reflects a parade of possible adversaries. A queen with perfect posture, a mistress with perfect timing, a lady-in-waiting with perfect listening skills. Each one fights a different silent battle. None are allowed to acknowledge it. A soft, sleepy joke rises in your mind. If medieval courts had reality TV, it would have broken every viewership record. Keeping up with the Capetians would have been absolute chaos. You step into a bright antechamber where perfume still clings to the furniture. Here, mistresses once gathered their allies, poets, musicians, whispering courtiers eager to bask in their glow. Flattery was currency. Attention was oxygen. And a well-placed compliment could travel through the palace faster than a wildfire rumored to be caused by witchcraft. Historians still argue whether one particularly nasty scandal involving a royal mistress was political sabotage or just a case of someone being very, very dramatic about a spilled drink. On a side table lies a delicate fan painted with roses, swans, and tiny hidden symbols. You can almost feel the electric rivalry humming through the air. Queens and mistresses learn to communicate in glances. The tilt of a chin could be an insult, the angle of a smile, a victory, the length of eye contact, a declaration of war. The men? Completely oblivious. They probably thought everyone was just in a good mood. A fringe tidbit drifts your way. One French king's mistress reportedly used her beauty routine as a tactical weapon, arriving slightly late to events, so the queen's entrance seemed dull in comparison. Imagine weaponizing eyeliner. That's power. You exit the room and follow the corridor toward a set of wide double doors. Behind them lies the queen's salon. You slip in. It's quieter here, but not calmer. The queen sits at the center of a constellation of ladies and advisors. She isn't shouting. She isn't arguing. She simply exists with enough poised dignity to remind everyone she is the one wearing the crown, even if she sometimes feels like she's wearing a target. Queens had to walk a tightrope. Too gentle. And the court dismissed them. Too assertive. And the court called them dangerous. Meanwhile, mistresses walked their own tightrope too bold, and they threatened the throne, too submissive, and they disappeared into irrelevance. You glide toward a tapestry depicting a queen and a king standing side by side. The queen looks serene. The mistress is nowhere in sight. That absence speaks louder than the embroidery ever could. Court artists often forgot mistresses existed, even when everyone knew they shaped half the royal decisions. History loves to pretend intrigue didn't exist, right up until it becomes too entertaining to ignore. A soft joke tickles your thoughts. Queens learn diplomacy from tutors. Mistresses learn diplomacy from survival. Either way, both ended up better politicians than half the council. A servant passes you carrying a silver tray topped with letters sealed in different colors, each one representing a faction. The queen gets the official letters. The mistress gets letters that matter. And somewhere in the palace, a young lady in waiting gets the letter that will ruin her sleep for the next week. You turn a corner, and find yourself in a smaller chamber where whispers still hang like smoke. This is where alliances formed, women sitting close, sharing secrets over sweetened wine. You picture them leaning in. If she appears tonight wearing pearls, it means she's aligned with the Visconti family. Court fashion wasn't about beauty, it was code. If you wore blue, you were courting favor. If you wore green, you were making a statement. If you wore the wrong color, congratulations, you accidentally declared political war. Historians still argue whether certain famous feuds between queens and mistresses were personal or purely political. Honestly, knowing royal courts, it was probably both, with a side of pettiness. As you walk deeper into the chamber, you notice a writing desk covered in notes, some in elegant handwriting, others in hurried scrawls. These were the battlefield plans, the strategies for dinners, seating arrangements, guest lists. The right seating order could secure peace. The wrong one could start 20 years of awkward tension between two nations that only wanted an excuse to fight anyway. A fringe tidbit taps your shoulder. In one court, the mistress and the queen ended up becoming close allies, mostly because the king was such a nuisance that cooperating was their only path to sanity. More power to them. You exhale, softly. The palace around you seems to vibrate with the memory of every rivalry that once shimmered beneath polite smiles. Scandals didn't happen in the shadows, they happened in plain sight, disguised as compliments, dances, dinners, and carefully placed fans. And now, with tension swirling around you like powdered perfume, you feel the pull toward the next realm of royal womanhood. Something more fragile, more private, and much riskier. Pregnancy in the palace maze. You leave the fragrance-thick chamber of rivalries and step into a quieter hallway where the torches burn lower, softer, as if even the flames understand that this next passage carries heavier stories. The walls feel warmer, almost protective, like they've absorbed centuries of anxious pacing from queens and princesses who learned the hard way that nothing in royal life was more dangerous or more politicized than becoming pregnant. You walk slowly, feeling the atmosphere change. This isn't just another corridor. This is the palace's heartbeat, thudding with hope, fear, duty, and consequences too large for any single body to bear. A mainstream fact whispers into place. In most royal courts, pregnancy wasn't a private matter. The queen's womb was national business. Her cravings, her morning sickness, the tilt of her belly, everything became diplomatic gossip, a political forecast, a reason for enemies to celebrate or panic. If you so much as sneezed while pregnant, someone somewhere interpreted it as an omen. You enter a broad chamber filled with soft cushions, embroidered blankets, and the faint scent of chamomile. This was the queen's resting room. Though rest wasn't really an option, every eye in the palace monitored her servants, tracking her appetite, midwives inspecting her posture, advisors quietly speculating whether the child would be male or a disappointment. Because yes, that's the word they used. Subtlety wasn't a medieval strength. A soft joke drifts across your thoughts. Royal women basically lived in a 9-month group project where everyone else insisted on grading them. You move toward a window framed by trailing vines, where moonlight spills onto a cradle carved from rosewood. The cradle is empty now, but centuries ago, it would have been the center of the kingdom. An impatient, silent throne waiting for its occupant. You imagine the queen standing right where you stand, clutching the windowsill, whispering prayers into the night that her body would cooperate, that her child would survive, that court physicians would tone down their weirdly cheerful announcements about herbal concoctions. A fringe tidbit makes you pause. Some midwives insisted that hearing beautiful music during pregnancy improved the chances of birthing a boy. Others advised the queen to avoid looking at unpleasant people, or she might imprint their features onto her child. So imagine the poor queen politely dodging courtiers all day. "I'm so sorry. I can't look at you right now, it's for national security." You step into a smaller adjoining room, filled with low stools, baskets of herbs, and wooden cabinets holding mysterious powders. Royal pregnancy wasn't just monitored, it was micromanaged. Advisors fussed about what the queen ate: no raw fruit, too risky; no cold water, too dangerous; no walking too far, you might fall; no sitting too long, you might compress something essential. Half of those ideas were nonsense, but when every miscarriage threatened dynastic collapse, superstition became policy. Historians still argue whether certain queens' miscarriages were natural or caused by stress, overhandling, or questionable medical practices. Some theories even suggest political rivals may have deliberately tampered with diets or medicines. When the future of a kingdom rides inside one woman, everyone suddenly becomes an amateur doctor with suspiciously strong opinions. You glide your hand across a table where birthing charms once lay tiny silver amulets, braided cords, miniature icons. They weren't magical, but they offered comfort in a world where childbirth was terrifying, even for ordinary women. For queens, it was a gamble, with kingdoms watching the dice roll. You drift toward a high-backed chair cushioned with velvet. The queen sat here during long evenings, knitting or reading while midwives hovered too close. Visitors paraded in ambassadors offering congratulations, nobles pretending not to be calculating their future positions, duchesses giving unsolicited advice like medieval mummy bloggers, and always, behind the queen's polite smile, the quiet knowledge that her life narrowed to a single duty: produce a healthy heir. Preferably male, preferably soon. A soft, sleepy joke slides through your mind. If pregnancy glow existed back then, it was probably just sweat from being constantly stressed. You pass through an archway into a dimmer chamber, almost womb-like in its coziness. Silk drapery muffles the sound of the palace beyond. This was where the queen retreated in her final months, the closest she ever came to privacy. But even here, whispers slipped under doors. Servants reported her mood. Advisors monitored the kings. Rumors churned like butter. And the queen? She waited. She breathed. She hoped. A fringe fact drifts in with the quiet. Some royal courts scheduled listening sessions where midwives placed their ears to the queen's belly to guess the baby's sex. These were full events, complete with predictions, wagers, and, occasionally, someone fainting dramatically, usually on purpose. You sit gently on the edge of the queen's daybed, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. Royal pregnancy wasn't just physical, it was emotional warfare. Every ache became a prophecy. Every craving became a debate. Every quiet moment became a chance to wonder what would happen if things went wrong. Historians still argue whether one, the famous queen, truly threw a bowl at her husband after a stressful pregnancy announcement, or if the story was invented by later writers who thought it sounded iconic. Honestly, knowing royal couples, it's probably only halfway exaggerated. You rise and walk toward the final doorway leading out of this sanctuary of anxious hope. Beyond it lies the birthing chamber, the place where the political and the personal collided in the most dramatic way possible. The palace breathes differently here, the torches dimming instinctively as you approach the threshold. The next chapter isn't about anticipation, it's about the moment everything is witnessed, recorded, judged, and forever remembered. You step through the narrow doorway, and the air thickens instantly, as if you've crossed into a room that remembers every scream, every prayer, every breath held in fear. This is the birthing chamber. Warm, crowded, overlit, heavy, with the scent of boiled linens, crushed herbs, and the metallic chill of anticipation. You pause, letting the atmosphere settle around you like a second skin. Here, birth wasn't private. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't intimate. It was performance, politics, and pressure rolled into one exhausting ritual. A mainstream fact settles quietly. In many royal courts, especially in France, England, and several Germanic states, queens were required to give birth in front of witnesses. Yes, actual spectators. Not because anyone enjoyed the show, at least, hopefully, but because legitimacy was everything. No one wanted rumors of baby swaps or secret stillbirths or, heaven forbid, accusations that the heir wasn't actually the king's. So the solution? Invite half the court to stand around awkwardly. You take a slow step deeper into the chamber. The walls are hung with thick tapestries meant to block drafts, though they now trap the tension instead. A half circle of chairs surrounds the queen's bed like a silent audience. You can almost hear the whispered commentary of noblewomen and officials leaning in. Did she cry out? Is it too soon? Did you see the midwife's face? Oh no, she's sweating again. What does the sweating mean? Historians still argue whether some courts required dozens of witnesses or merely a handful of carefully chosen ones. But either way, the queen had zero privacy at the most vulnerable moment of her life. Meanwhile, the king? Off playing cards, maybe. Or praying. Or just pacing dramatically like a man who has never experienced childbirth yet insists the stress is really getting to him. You move closer to the bed, draped with embroidered sheets. You let your hand hover, above them not touching, just sensing the echoes. This was where queens clung to headboards, crushing fabric between their fists, while ladies in waiting dabbed their foreheads and physicians muttered confidently incorrect theories about humours and vapours. A fringe tidbit slips into your ear. Some courts believed a difficult birth meant the queen had sinned or angered fate, while an easy birth supposedly proved her moral purity. So on top of everything else, royal childbirth came with a performance review from the universe. Very relaxing. A soft, sleepy joke stirs. Imagine being in unbearable labour while 40 people judge your breathing technique. It's like the world's worst yoga class. You walk toward a low table filled with strange instruments, wooden paddles, bronze spoons, herbal poultices, and a few items whose purpose you decide not to think about too hard this close to bedtime. The midwife was the true power here. She determined which herbs the queen drank. She interpreted signs, omens, and bodily clues. She coached. She soothed. She occasionally yelled. She lived in a constant dance between medical instinct and royal politics. Because if anything went wrong, the midwife wasn't just blamed, she was ruined. You touch the corner of a folded cloth, imagining the room filling with steam from boiling water, servants rushing in and out, whispers rising like smoke. Outside, the palace waited in breathless silence. Courtiers stood in clusters, pretending not to speculate. Bells were ready to ring out news, messengers prepared to sprint. Everything hinged on a single outcome: male heir or not. You step toward the far side of the room, where a small balcony door stands slightly ajar. You slip through it and enter a narrow viewing loft. Yes, some birthing chambers had these where additional witnesses could observe without crowding the queen's space. You stare at the vantage point, horrified and fascinated. Imagine being the queen and seeing silhouettes up there. The worst mezzanine seats in history. Historians still argue whether one famous birth where the queen suddenly fainted caused panic because witnesses believed she died mid-labor. Some records say they broke the windows to let in fresh air. Others claim it was just a dramatic rumor invented decades later. Either way, the birth survived as legend. You return inside and follow the path toward a small basket filled with clean cloths, rags, and one tiny silver rattle engraved with protective symbols. That rattle was more than a toy, it was a royal announcement waiting to happen. The moment the baby cried, a courtier would rush to proclaim the gender. If it was a boy, cheers erupted. If it was a girl, polite applause. Very polite. Kind of too polite. A soft joke rises gently. Imagine being a newborn girl and sensing the room's energy like, wow, tough crowd. But beneath the politics, beneath the ceremony, beneath the tension, something more. Human settles around you like warm breath. Royal women endured childbirth the same way all women did, through courage, pain, hope, fear, and the determination to survive long enough to hold the tiny life they'd carried. You kneel beside the bed and feel the history humming in the wood. The cries of mothers are gone, but the resilience remains, woven into the fibers like threads of gold. The room whispers its final truth to you. Birth brought heirs, but it also brought blame, expectations, and consequences no queen could escape. And when the baby was delivered, and the applause or disappointment faded, another fate awaited the queen, one more dangerous than childbirth itself. Because if the baby wasn't a boy, the kingdom had opinions, loud ones. And that's where you're headed next. You step out of the charged, echoing birthing chamber into a hallway that feels strangely hollow, like the palace itself is pausing, waiting to hear what kind of cry just came from behind those heavy doors. A single breath can tip the emotional balance of the entire kingdom. And tonight, you're walking straight into the fallout of that moment, the moment when the baby is lifted, examined, declared, and judged, not as a child, but as a political outcome. The corridor is lined with portraits of queens holding infants, some smiling serenely, others looking like they want to be anywhere else. Their painted expressions tell stories no official chronicle ever dared to write. A mainstream fact floats gently into place. In royal courts from England to the Ottomans to Ming China, queens who failed to produce male heirs were not merely unlucky, they were blamed. Politely at first, then politically, then personally. Somehow, despite basic biology, the burden always landed on the woman. Logic was not a strong feature of historical ruling classes. You pause before a portrait of a queen cradling a baby girl. Her face is beautifully painted, almost luminous, but her eyes hold a flicker of fear. Not because she didn't love her child, but because she knew what everyone else would whisper the moment the doors closed. You feel those whispers now. They slither through the corridor like thin threads of smoke. It's a girl? Oh, Well, perhaps next time. Maybe she prayed incorrectly. My cousin's midwife said, this always happens when the moon is waning. Historians still argue whether queens truly internalized the blame or whether they quietly raged behind closed doors. Some letters suggest heartbreak. Others suggest resignation. A few reveal sharp, sarcastic humor, because when the entire kingdom critiques your uterus, sarcasm becomes survival. You wander toward the nursery wing, where a soft glow of lamplight spills across the floor. A rocking cradle sits in the center, carved with vines and tiny crowns. It's beautiful. It's delicate. And for royal mothers, it was often a daily reminder of political pressure. A fringe tidbit enters the room like a mischievous breeze. In several courts, if the first 2 or 3 children were girls, the queen received increasingly bizarre fertility advice, including being told to avoid eating cold foods, avoid looking at donkeys, or sleep only on her left side while dreaming of dragons. Medieval science was 90% superstition and 10% let's make it up as we go. You lean against the cradle and imagine the queen standing where you stand, tired, aching, radiant, terrified. The court expects her to smile. The king expects her to try again. The council expects her to stop disappointing them. And all she really wants is to sleep for 12 hours and then eat an entire pie without commentary. A soft, sleep-friendly joke rises. Being a royal mother wasn't so much a job as a high-stakes performance review that happened every 9 months. You continue moving, drawn to a quiet corner where a small shelf holds gifts brought by nobles' embroidered blankets, golden rattles, protective amulets, and letters politely pretending to celebrate a girl while radiating disappointment. One letter lies open, its ink faded but still legible enough to read the subtext. Your Majesty, congratulations on the birth of your daughter. She will surely bring grace, beauty, and future diplomatic usefulness. Diplomatic usefulness, the medieval equivalent of we'll find a purpose for her later. You inhale deeply, sensing the queen's next challenge. If she gave birth to a girl, she wasn't just comforting her child, she was already preparing mentally for the next pregnancy. Royal women had no space to heal, no break, no real choice. Pregnancy was a cycle without pause, and every failed attempt failed, meaning not a boy, tightened the palace's atmosphere like a shrinking corset. Historians still argue whether kings truly blamed their wives, or whether ministers manipulated the situation to gain influence. In some cases, the king defended the queen fiercely. In others, well, history has plenty of kings who paced dramatically before declaring, "It must be her fault." Shocking, right? Men refusing to accept biological science. You walk farther into the nursery and find a small wooden rocking horse paint peeling, one ear missing. You run your hand along it softly, feeling the grooves worn by tiny hands centuries ago. Girl or boy, each child mattered deeply to the mother. But only one mattered to the kingdom, and that imbalance sat like a stone on every queen's chest. A fringe fact whispers from the walls. Some courts secretly rejoiced when the heir was female. Why? Because daughters forged alliances, brought dowries, and often stabilized political landscapes. Male heirs, on the other hand, sometimes led rebellions, plotted coups, or caused succession crises. In other words, baby girls occasionally saved kingdoms simply by existing. You step into a small balcony alcove where cold night air brushes your face. Down below, the palace glows with lanterns. Courtiers gather like moths around fountains, whispering, watching, calculating. Somewhere, the king awaits the official announcement. Somewhere else, servants hold their breath. And above it all, the queen lies in her bed, sore, exhausted, and judged before she even meets her child properly. A soft joke slips in like a sigh. If medieval queens had group chats, the message would read, "Delivered one healthy human child." Court disappointed. 0/10th experience. You let the night wind settle around you. You feel the weight of that disappointment, but also the quiet strength of the mothers who lived through it, who endured the whispers, who tried again and again and again. Some succeeded, some didn't. Some turned their daughters into powerful alliances. Some turned them into legends. And some, those with a spark of strategy, transformed failure into influence. But in the palace, influence always comes with a risk, and nothing brings out that risk faster than whispers of poison, plots, and blame. which is exactly where you're heading next. You leave the nursery wing behind, stepping into a long, dim corridor where the air suddenly tastes different, sharper, metallic, tinged with something that feels like suspicion left out too long in the heat. This is where the palace walls stop whispering and start listening, where every footstep carries a shadow, and every shadow carries a rumor. You can feel it before you see it. The world of poisons, plots, and accusations has its own temperature, and it's cold. Your shoes click softly against the polished floor as you move deeper in. Torches flicker uneasily, creating pockets of darkness that seem to shift whenever you're not looking. This is the invisible battlefield, where royal women were often placed at the center of storms. They didn't start storms that needed a scapegoat, and queens made convenient ones. A mainstream fact brushes your senses. Across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, royal women were blamed for everything from fertility problems to failed harvests to mysterious deaths in the court. If someone got sick mysteriously, a woman had poisoned him. If a prince died suddenly, a woman schemed it. If a war started, clearly a woman whispered the wrong thing into the king's ear. Basically, queens were the medieval version of the error message that pops up when no one knows what the real issue is. You walk through an archway into a small chamber lined with shelves. Strange glass bottles sit in neat rows, some filled with dried herbs, others with dark powders sealed under wax. These aren't poisons, they're medicines, spices, perfumes. But the line between medicinal and murderous was thin in the minds of suspicious courtiers. A queen caught with the wrong jar in her possession could face accusations faster than you can say, maybe check for mold first. A soft, sleepy joke floats in. If medieval people had Yelp, half the reviews would be, 2 stars, thought my stew was poisoned, might return. You move to a table covered with scrolls and small brass tools. One parchment lies open, its ink faded but unmistakable. It's a list of forbidden substances for palace kitchens: opium, belladonna, hemlock, arsenic. The presence of such a list should be comforting, but the fact that it needed to exist, less so. Historians still argue whether certain queens truly used poison or whether political rivals invented the stories. In many cases, no evidence existed, just rumors fed by fear, misogyny, and the irresistible appeal of a dramatic tale. After all, blaming fate or incompetence was boring. Blaming a queen? That sold. You step into the next room, and the walls feel tighter. This is the accusation chamber, figuratively speaking, though it might as well be literal. Here, rival factions whispered theories, lawyers drafted charges, and spies delivered half-truths polished into whole lies. If the queen was childless, too educated, too foreign, too assertive, or simply too unlucky, she became a target. A fringe tidbit drops into your thoughts. In one royal court, merely owning a small book of herbal remedies was enough to brand a woman as a suspected poisoner, which is rich, considering half the male doctors of the era practiced medicine that looked suspiciously like witchcraft, but with worse handwriting. You move forward until you see it, a small, ornate box on a pedestal. Inside is a silver spoon, its bowl stained dark. The story claims it belonged to a queen accused of poisoning a rival's wine. Truth? Probably not. But royal myth-making doesn't need truth, it just needs a compelling narrative and an audience willing to gasp dramatically. You run your fingers lightly along the edge of the pedestal. You can almost hear the arguments that once filled this room. She lies. She plots. She seeks to harm the heir. She desires the throne. And beneath those accusations, the truth no one said aloud. She is powerful. She is clever. She threatens us. You continue on, stepping into a narrow stone stairwell spiraling downward. The air grows cooler. You feel the heaviness of histories that were never officially recorded. Women isolated, interrogated, silenced. Not all were guilty. Most weren't. But accusation alone could destroy a life. Historians still debate a famous case where a queen was charged with orchestrating a poisoning plot because a foreign diplomat fell ill after dinner. The man later admitted he'd simply overeaten salted fish. But by that time, rumors had spread across 3 kingdoms, because apparently indigestion wasn't dramatic enough. You descend until you reach a subterranean chamber, lined with thick doors, storage rooms, records rooms, and, sometimes, holding rooms. You shiver, sensing the ghosts of scandals echoing through the stone. A soft joke flickers. If you think modern office politics are bad, imagine trying to survive a workplace where someone might accuse you of murder because you look too tired during breakfast. You move back upward, the palace warming around you again. At the top of the stairs, you return to a long hallway where narrow windows let moonlight stream in. The glow paints the floor silver, calm, gentle, as if trying to soothe the tension lingering in your chest. You pause here, feeling the weight of what you've just walked through. Royal women lived with the constant threat of accusations, real or fabricated. Their slightest misstep could become the seed of a scandal planted by enemies who watered it with jealousy and ambition. But even accusations didn't always lead to destruction. Sometimes they led to exile, and exile in the palace world was its own cage, gilded, silent, and suffocating. Which is where you're heading next. You follow the silver ribbon of moonlight down the corridor until it thins out and disappears into a heavier darkness. A darkness that feels padded, muffled, almost velvet-lined. This part of the palace breathes differently, slower, quieter, like a wing of the building designed not for living but for waiting. And that's when you realize where you're going. Exile. Not the dramatic kind with ships and storms and tearful farewells. No, this is palace exile. The kind hidden behind silk curtains and polite phrases. Retirement. Rest. A temporary withdrawal from public life. But everyone knows the truth. A disgraced queen or unwanted consort isn't removed from the palace. She's absorbed by it. You step into a long gallery dimly lit by a single lantern swinging gently from its hook. The floor is covered in thick carpets to muffle footsteps. The walls are lined with doors, each one leading to a chamber where a royal woman once waited for forgiveness, relevance, simply the courtesy of being remembered. A mainstream fact slips into your mind, soft as a sigh. Many courts across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia maintained gilded apartments for women who fell out of political favor. These weren't prisons in the traditional sense. There were no chains, no barred windows, no locks, but they didn't need them. Reputation was the real cage. Once a woman was sent here, she rarely returned to her former life. You approach the first door. The wood is painted with delicate flowers that have long faded. You imagine the queen who lived here, clutching letters that never arrived, pacing the floor while outside. The court continued without her. Exile wasn't about distance. It was about invisibility. A queen could live just 50 steps away from the throne and still feel as far from power as a star hanging in winter sky. A soft, sleepy joke drifts into your thoughts. Palace exile was basically the medieval version of being muted in the group chat. You step inside the room. Its surprisingly beautiful silk drapes, soft cushions, warm tapestries depicting gardens filled with birds. But the beauty feels hollow, like being given a bouquet of flowers after being fired. Everything here is designed to soothe without empowering, to decorate without offering hope. You run your hand along the smooth surface of a vanity table. On it sits a silver brush, its bristles dulled from use. You picture a queen sitting here, brushing her hair slowly, trying to make the movements feel purposeful, trying to pretend she wasn't waiting for footsteps that might never come, for apologies, for explanations, for a miracle. Historians still argue whether some exiled women truly deserved their fates or whether they were simply too clever, too influential, too foreign, too outspoken. Patterns repeat across centuries. A queen who threatened the wrong man's ego could find herself reassigned to spiritual reflection, which is code for we. You want you somewhere quiet where you can't ruin our plans. You move to the far end of the room where a balcony door stands slightly open. You step out into the night air. The view is stunning, gardens stretching out in moonlit silence, fountains glimmering like shards of stars. And yet, from this balcony, the queen would have watched life go on without her. She saw banquets from afar, heard music drifting from the great hall, smelled roast meats and spices carried by warm breezes. She lived among reminders of a world she no longer belonged to. A fringe tidbit brushes your ear. In some empires, disgraced royal women were placed in secluded pavilions, staffed with attendants who were instructed never to bring news unless explicitly asked. The result? Women sometimes learned about major political changes years after they happened. Imagine finding out your stepson became king through a casually mentioned comment while receiving your afternoon tea. You return inside and continue down the hallway to another door. This one is heavier, made of darker wood. You push it open and step into a smaller chamber lit by a single candle. The flame trembles as if startled. The room is more modest, simple linens, a single writing desk, a chest tucked in the corner. You can almost feel the loneliness clinging to the walls, like a second skin. This is where a concubine or secondary wife might have been exiled after losing the king's favor, or worse, after being accused of interfering in succession matters. Her rivals would whisper that she became melancholic, which is royal court language for, "We've decided you're inconvenient now." You sit at the desk and imagine her writing letters she wasn't sure would reach anyone. Some women wrote to sisters or mothers, some wrote prayers, some wrote nothing at all. Because in royal exile, even words felt dangerous. They could be intercepted, misinterpreted, used against you. Silence was often safer than honesty. Yet even here, life persisted. Exiled, women read, embroidered, taught their servants skills, cared for their children if they were permitted to stay. They survived with a quiet dignity that history rarely mentions. A soft joke sighs into your thoughts. Honestly, palace exile sounds like a forced spa retreat, but with 100% less relaxation. You rise and walk into a final room at the corridor's end. This one is different, larger, colder. The walls are bare. The air smells faintly of dust and old resignation. You stand in the center, listening to the silence pressing in. This is where the palace sent its most politically dangerous women, the ones whose reputations threatened to outshine the king's, whose alliances ran too deep, whose intelligence was too sharp to ignore. Their exile wasn't about punishment. It was about containment. Better to hide a brilliant woman than risk her controlling the board. Historians still argue whether one legendary queen truly lived out decades hereafter, being falsely accused of treason, or whether her story was twisted by later writers into something more tragic for dramatic flair. Knowing royal courts? Probably a mixture of both with a generous spoonful of embellishment. You lean against the wall, letting its coldness seep into your back. The truth settles around you slowly. Exile wasn't the end of a royal woman's story. It was a pause, a long, quiet inhale before she chose to wait, to plot, to survive, or to reinvent herself entirely. And many did, but none did it alone. Because the next part of royal survival relied on something far more powerful than titles or beauty. Friendships, favors, alliances, the invisible threads that kept a royal woman alive. And that's where you're going now. You leave the silent, padded corridor of exile and step into a passage that feels warmer, brighter, somehow more alive. The air shifts lighter now, carrying the soft scent of parchment, lavender, and the faint murmur of voices behind. Half-closed doors. You can almost feel the palace adjusting around you, as if it's whispering. Not every woman survived alone. Not every queen faded. Not every exile remained forgotten. Because this is the wing where invisible lifelines were woven. Friendships, favors, confidantes, alliances, and loyalties that existed long before anyone bothered to write them down. If a royal woman survived the palace maze, it was rarely by accident. It was because she had people. You step into a circular antechamber brimming with echoes. Laughter lingers in the corners, quiet sobs in the walls, and 1,000 secrets float dust-like in the golden torchlight. This is where ladies-in-waiting gathered, women raised alongside queens, educated with them, sometimes married off near them, always orbiting their lives like delicate but fiercely loyal moons. A mainstream fact curls softly into place. Across European, Middle Eastern, African, and Asian courts, the queen's household, her attendants, governesses, chambermaids, tutors, scribes, functioned almost like a miniature government. These women knew court gossip before the council did. They knew which noble had insulted which ambassador, which mistress was rising in favor, which steward was stealing money, and which guard had the unfortunate habit of snoring outside the queen's door. You walk farther in, listening to the whisper of silk skirts brushing stone. Ladies-in-waiting weren't just glorified companions. They were informants, whisper carriers, strategists. And in a world where queens were expected to remain serene furniture, ladies-in-waiting gave them eyes, ears, and occasionally the exact piece of information needed to avoid political disaster. A soft joke drifts across your thoughts. Royal survival basically required an entire girl group with extremely advanced emotional intelligence. You move toward a window seat where 2 chairs sit side by side, cushions pressed into familiar shapes. You picture 2 women, sitting here late at night, sipping spiced wine while exchanging worries that couldn't be spoken in daylight. Perhaps the queen confessed her fear of losing influence. Perhaps her favorite lady confided her dread of an arranged marriage coming too soon. These friendships weren't decorative, they were lifelines, built on shared danger, whispered relief, and trust forged in a place where trust was rare. Historians still argue whether certain queens truly had best friends, or whether these relationships were exaggerated by later writers hoping to soften their legacies. But diaries, poems, and a surprising number of embroidered handkerchiefs suggest the bonds were real, deep, and often the only refuge a royal woman had. You continue down the hallway until you reach a small salon glowing with firelight. Cushions spill across the floor in warm, inviting colors. Low tables hold half-finished letters, bits of ribbon, sewing work, small musical instruments. This room feels lived, lively even. The kind of space where secrets flowed freely, disguised as casual conversation. A fringe tidbit breezes in. Some queens used embroidery circles as covert strategy meetings. Needle in one hand, political agenda in the other. Men assumed women stitching flowers onto linen were harmless. Meanwhile, those women were quietly deciding who lived, who fell from favor, and which ambassador would receive the cold shoulder at dinner. You lean over a low table and notice a letter sealed with green wax. It's addressed not to a noble, but to a merchant's wife in a distant city. Queens often forged networks beyond the palace merchants, abbesses, midwives, widows, musicians, healers. These weren't just acquaintances, they were resources. A queen couldn't move army regiments, but she could move information. She could control hospitality. She could influence fashion. She could shift cultural taste, which, believe it or not, shifted politics. A soft, sleepy joke nudges. You. The real power wasn't in the crown. It was in who controlled the palace's rumor flow. You walk toward another chamber where a group of women once met around a round table. You can almost see them, one reading aloud a letter from home, another relaying the latest scandal from the kitchens, another practicing how to subtly redirect a conversation at a banquet without insulting anyone. These women trained together like political athletes. They learned to read the king's moods, to interpret the council's behavior, to sense shifts in power the way sailors sense changes in wind. But friendships weren't the only lifelines. Favors were the palace's unofficial currency. You enter a room filled with shelves of neatly stacked boxes, gift boxes, each labeled, each tied with ribbon, small tokens of gratitude or promises owed. A queen might give a hairpin to a noblewoman who helped her smooth over a diplomatic embarrassment, a bracelet to the wife of a general, a ring to a midwife who offered comfort during a miscarriage. These weren't bribes, they were anchors, gentle reminders of loyalty in a world where loyalty was slippery. Historians still argue whether some queens overused this system, trading favors like playing cards. Some say it destabilized the court, others say it saved it. You walk toward the final room, smaller, warmer, a private retreat. A fire crackles softly in the hearth. Cushions lie scattered in the cozy messiness of people who felt safe enough to be imperfect. This was the queen's inner circle, the handful of women she trusted more than anyone. Siblings, cousins, childhood friends. Occasionally, even former rivals transformed by shared trauma into allies. A fringe fact hums to life. In one historical court, a queen survived 3 assassination attempts solely because her ladies-in-waiting formed a protective network, intercepting threats and subtly rerouting danger like human shields, made of loyalty and impeccable etiquette. You sit on a cushion near the fire and feel the warmth seep into your bones. This room feels different from the grand halls and glittering courts you've walked through. Here, laughter once rang freely. Tears were allowed. Secrets were spoken gently. Here, royal women weren't symbols or scapegoats. They were human. And it's here, right here, that many queens drew the strength to return from exile, to rebuild ruined reputations, to gently nudge kingdoms toward better futures. Not with armies, not with crowns, but with relationships that transcended rank and ambition. A final soft joke flickers. In a palace full of politics, the most powerful weapon was emotional support. Who would have guessed? You rise, leaving the warmth behind. Ahead lies another corridor, one filled not with allies, but with ambition. Because some women didn't just survive court life, they ruled it, even when no one expected them to. You drift out of the warm circle of confidantes and step into a hallway that feels different. Not colder, not darker, sharper. The air hums here, vibrating with a low, electric awareness, as if the walls themselves have leaned in to watch closely. You've entered the realm of women who weren't meant to rule, but ruled anyway. The shift is subtle at first. The corridors widen, the tapestries grow grander, the torches stand taller, burning brighter, as though paying respect to the footsteps of women who walked these halls with a poise that defied their titles or their lack of them. A mainstream fact slides gently into place. Across kingdoms on nearly every continent, royal women who had no official authority still shaped political decisions, negotiated treaties, directed cultural movements, influenced royal successions, and occasionally commanded armies through proxies. They weren't queens regnant, they weren't elected, they weren't crowned, but they were powerful, dangerous, even, to the people who underestimated them. You continue walking until you reach a long gallery lined with portraits. Women stare down from gilded frames, some in velvet gowns, some in embroidered robes, some armored in silk, some veiled, some radiant, some solemn. Their eyes all hold the same glimmer. I wasn't supposed to rule. I ruled anyway. You pause before one painting where a consort stands beside a throne, her hand resting lightly on the armrest, not gripping it, just touching it with that casual, quiet confidence that says, I don't need the crown on my head to know it answers to me. A soft, sleepy joke wiggles through your thoughts. Queens learned early that if you speak softly enough, kings think they came up with your ideas themselves. Tactical whispering. The lost art form. You walk on and enter a reading chamber, where scrolls lie open across a table. Maps, letters, tax records, the kinds of documents women weren't supposed to handle. And yet here they are, edges curling with age, ink faded, but intentions still alive. A woman once sat at this table, absorbing information, weaving it into strategy like a loom turning threads into tapestries. Historians still argue whether she acted alone or guided a network of advisors. They debate whether her policies were hers or merely influenced by her. But the documents don't care. They hold the truth quietly. Her fingerprints are everywhere. You stand and let your fingers glide across the surface. You imagine her bent over these same maps, calculating how to prevent a war the king was too boastful to avoid, or how to redirect funds to stabilize starving villages, or how to craft a marriage alliance that protected her daughter from political predators. Royal women who ruled unofficially didn't aim for glory. Glory was too risky. They aimed for longevity, stability, subtle triumphs. You follow the corridor into a sunken chamber lit by candles arranged in a circle. This room once hosted private councils, not official ones, but the Queen's own trusted circle, advisors who valued discretion, diplomats who understood nuance, generals who recognized her intelligence even if they weren't allowed to acknowledge it publicly. A fringe tidbit shimmers softly. In one medieval court, the king was such a poor administrator that the Queen and her ladies created a secret nighttime council to manage the kingdom while he slept. He bragged that his reign was unusually peaceful. It was peaceful because he was not involved. You smile, amused, before the seriousness of the chamber settles over you again. You wander to the far side where a tall window reveals the inner courtyard. Moonlight spills down onto stone benches arranged in a perfect square. From here, a queen could see everyone entering or leaving the political chambers. Knowledge was power, but positioning? That was better. A soft joke nudges you. Palace politics were 20% intelligence, 80% being in the right hallway at the right time. You turn back inside and step into a walk-through library where scrolls are stacked in bundles wrapped with ribbon. Some are treaties signed by queens acting as temporary guardians. Others are letters sent in the name of the king, but written unmistakably in the Queen's hand, and still others are foreign correspondences sealed under the Queen's personal emblem. Historians still argue whether these letters represented queens acting independently or simply assisting incompetent kings, but the consistency of the handwriting suggests a simpler explanation. They were running the show. You move toward a small wooden desk in the corner, the kind of workspace someone uses for private thoughts, not formal declarations. A quill still rests inside an inkwell. The parchment before it is blank, but you can almost feel the weight of the messages that once flowed from this place. Words shaped alliances, words saved lives, words ended conflicts, and sometimes started them. You sit for a moment, imagining yourself in her position, the queen consort or dowager or regent in all but name. Every decision had to be disguised as a suggestion, every command softened into a gentle thought, every triumph hidden beneath layers of polite humility, power wrapped in grace. A fringe fact brushes your ear. In one empire, women were forbidden from issuing decrees. So the queen sent instructions, which were treated as urgent recommendations of the highest priority, which eventually became indistinguishable from decrees anyway. Bureaucracy is nothing if not flexible. You rise, stepping into the next room where a long dining table stretches toward a fireplace. Here, queens brokered peace over meals, charmed ambassadors with stories, tested alliances with humor, and subtly redirected conversations away from disasters the council hadn't yet noticed. You picture a queen lifting a goblet, smiling beautifully, and saying something like, "Perhaps we should reconsider that border decision," which royal mother language translates to, "If you don't stop this stupidity, we will lose a province by next Tuesday." You continue walking until you reach the final chamber. Smaller, darker, quiet. This is the room where everything crystallized, the decisions no one could know she made, the tears she allowed only here, the fears she folded carefully into prayer, or poetry, or silence. This is where unofficial rulers confronted the weight of leadership with no protection, no recognition, and no thanks. You breathe in. Slowly, deeply. You sense the hum of invisible crowns, crowns made of influence, resilience, and intellect rather than jewels. Women who weren't supposed to rule, but did. Women who didn't wear power, but radiated it. Women who shaped kingdoms in ways history still tries to untangle. And now, your journey turns again toward what happens when these women suddenly find themselves without a king beside them. When widowhood arrives like a storm that can free them or trap them forever. You leave the chamber of unseen crowns behind and wander into a quieter wing of the palace, one where the air shifts toward something older, softer, and heavier all at once. Widowhood. It wraps around this corridor like an invisible shawl, carrying the scent of extinguished candles, folded garments, and decisions too delicate to speak aloud. The palace seems to walk slower here, as if even stone understands that a royal woman newly without her king stands on the edge of a different kind of power, or a different kind of peril. Your footsteps echo gently as you enter a long hallway hung with dark drapes. Portraits line the walls, queens painted twice. Once beside their husbands, gaze demure, and once alone, gaze direct. It's startling how the posture changes. Without a king beside them, royal widows no longer needed to perform softness. They could look straight ahead. They could be sharp. They could be finally themselves. A mainstream fact glides quietly into your thoughts. Widowhood was a turning point in many royal courts. A queen who had spent her life obeying court protocol could suddenly become a dowager, an elder stateswoman with her own household, income, lands, and influence. But it could also strip her of purpose overnight. Whether she rose or crumbled depended entirely on her alliances, her reputation, her children, and how threatened the new power brokers felt by her existence. You continue walking until you reach a small chamber draped in mourning black. A single taper flickers in a silver holder. You step closer and feel the chill of a room built for reflection, the Queen's vigil room. This is where a widow spent her first nights after the king's death, surrounded by silence, prayers, and the quiet rustle of attendants who weren't sure whether to speak or vanish. A soft, sleepy joke drifts gently through your mind. Royal mourning customs made modern office dress codes look like unhinged freestyle. "Sorry, Your Majesty, you wore grey instead of full black. That's a 10-day scandal now." You look toward a low table where mourning garb lies neatly folded, heavy veils, black silk gowns, gloves designed to hide every inch of skin. Royal widows weren't just grieving. They were expected to perform grief. The court watched how loudly they cried, how many tears they shed, whether their sorrow appeared appropriate. Too much grief looked suspicious. Too little looked worse. Historians still argue whether some widows exaggerated their despair to protect themselves from political rivals, or whether others hid their heartbreak behind a steel facade to maintain dignity in front of watching enemies. Both methods worked. Both failed. Court life wasn't exactly known for its emotional consistency. You move deeper into the room and find a carved chest containing items of remembrance letters tied with ribbon, small icons, embroidered handkerchiefs. Queens often kept mementos of their husbands, even when their marriages were far from loving. Royal unions were complicated. Duty and affection tangled like vines. In some cases, love blossomed. In others, love never existed. But widowhood always came with its own flavor of loneliness. You leave the vigil room and enter a brighter chamber where sunlight filters through patterned screens. This is the dowager's receiving room, the place where her future took shape. Chairs arranged in careful circles, a writing desk with fresh paper, shelves stacked with treaties and genealogies. One side of the room hums with potential authority. The other side hums with danger. Because a widow with adult sons? A potential advisor. A widow with minor sons? A regent. A widow with no surviving children? A political inconvenience. And a widow who was popular, intelligent, or wealthy? Oh, she was a threat. A fringe tidbit chimes in. In one European kingdom, dowager queens were legally required to move into a separate palace after their husbands died to minimize influence, the council said. To keep them from stirring trouble, rivals whispered. To keep them alive, some historians argue. You step toward the window, where sunlight lands in a soft pool on the rug. You imagine the dowager queen standing in that exact spot, reading the mood of the court like a weather oracle. She'd know immediately whether the new king, perhaps her son, perhaps her stepson, wanted her counsel or her silence. Whether he would honor her, tolerate her, or quietly imprison her in luxury. A soft joke curls up lazily. Royal widows had three choices: retire gracefully, rule subtly, or start a feud that historians would discuss for 500 years. You continue walking down the hall until you reach a door carved with symbols of wisdom, protection, and time. You open it and step into a private library filled with scrolls and bound books. This was where widows learned to wield softer forms of power, through patronage, through correspondence, through carefully timed visits to religious institutions. Through mentorship of younger royal women, the dowager became a living archive, a reminder, a guardian of memory. But even memory could be dangerous. Too many stories, too much influence, too much knowledge, these made her a rival to younger factions in the palace who wanted a clean slate. Historians still argue whether certain widows truly meddled in state affairs, or whether they were framed by ambitious ministers eager to eliminate a seasoned player. Royal politics never missed an opportunity to blame a woman for having opinions. You wander toward the final chamber, the dowager's private room. Small, quiet, beautiful. A writing table sits near the window. A teacup rests beside a half-written letter. You can feel her here, thinking, choosing, deciding whether to step back or step in. Some widows became kingmakers, guiding their sons like invisible hands. Some became peacekeepers. Some became patronesses of art, science, or religion. Some simply wanted to be left alone after decades of duty. Some never had that luxury. You stand in the center of the room and feel the bittersweet ache of widowhood settle around you. It's a threshold, a liberation, a prison, a transformation, sometimes all at once. You breathe in the scent of dried flowers and ink. Widowhood didn't end a queen's influence. Sometimes it was the beginning of her legend. But the path ahead isn't gentle. Not when a widow is sent far from home, not when she becomes a foreign queen in a land that will never fully accept her. And that's where you're walking next. You step out of the hush of widowhood and into a corridor that feels taller, cooler, and strangely unfamiliar, like the architecture itself has shifted beneath your feet. The air smells different here. Not worse. Not better. Just not home. And that's exactly the sensation pressing gently against your ribs as you continue forward. Because now, you're stepping into the world of foreign, queens women uprooted from everything they knew and dropped into courts where every word, gesture, and garment could be misread. A soft wind crawls along the stone floor, carrying faint scents of spices, distant kitchens, and foreign incense. You imagine what it felt like for a princess traveling across continents to marry a king she'd never seen, in a land whose customs were as strange to her as the stars in someone else's sky. A mainstream fact slips into place. For centuries, royal marriages were almost always international deals. French queens in England, Byzantine princesses in Russia, Italian consorts in France, Mongol brides in Persia. These women were political bridges, but the bridges were often set on fire from both ends. Their birth families expected loyalty. Their new families demanded assimilation. Their new subjects? Suspicious at best, hostile at worst. You continue down the corridor until you reach a large door carved with two sets of symbols, one on the left, from the Queen's homeland, one on the right from her new kingdom. The symbolism is touching, but the tension behind it trembles like a tight string on a harp. You step into the chamber beyond. It's breathtaking. Silk cushions embroidered with styles from two cultures, tapestries mixing motifs, dragons beside lions, lotus flowers beside fleur-de-lis. But beneath the beauty, something quieter hums. A longing, a homesickness. The chamber feels like a love letter to a life she didn't get to keep. A soft, sleepy joke drifts in. Foreign queens were basically dropped into medieval social circles with the energy of, "Hi, I don't speak your language. Please stop judging my sleeves." You move toward the writing desk where 2 letters lie open, both unfinished. The handwriting differs, one flowing gracefully, one sharp and foreign-looking. You guess instantly. One letter written to her mother, the other to her new king. 2 personas, 2 worlds, 2 versions of herself carefully, balanced. Historians still argue whether foreign queens felt divided or simply adaptable. Some sources describe them as cultural ambassadors, blending traditions beautifully. Others depict them as lonely figures muttering prayers in languages no one around them understood. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, complex, tender, and messy. You drift toward the balcony. Outside, the palace courtyard glows unfamiliar. Turrets shaped differently, trees pruned differently. Even the song of night insects hums in a different rhythm. You hear the faint murmur of guards speaking in a language the foreign queen had to learn quickly, or trust translators who may have had agendas. A fringe tidbit brushes your ear. In some courts, foreign queens were assigned attendants who secretly reported everything they did, what they ate, whom they spoke to, whether they clung too tightly to customs of home. Homesickness wasn't just an emotion. It was monitored like a political vulnerability. You step away from the balcony and toward a wardrobe carved from dark wood. Inside, gowns hang in 2 distinct styles. One set from her homeland, vibrant, flowing, decorated in patterns familiar to her hands. The other set from her new kingdom, structured, heavy, studded with symbolism she hadn't grown up with. You imagine her staring at the gowns each morning, choosing not clothing but identity. A soft whisper joke lingers. What do I wear today? My comfort or my duty? You close the wardrobe silently and continue toward a small alcove containing a shrine. Candles burned low, icons arranged carefully. A religious symbol from her homeland sits beside a new one from her marriage, an uneasy coexistence. Some foreign queens fought to maintain their faith. Some quietly converted, some pretended to choose while secretly keeping rituals alive at dawn or midnight. Historians still argue whether one famous queen's refusal to abandon her childhood religion caused a civil rift or whether the rift simply needed someone to blame. Either way, she became a symbol of foreign influence, a phrase kingdoms have always wielded like a weapon. You move deeper into the room where a round table sits, surrounded by patterned cushions. This was her meeting room where she welcomed ambassadors, noblewomen, scribes, and curious courtiers eager to see the foreign bride up close. Some visited out of kindness, some out of fascination, some to find flaws. A fringe fact flickers. Several foreign queens introduced new fashions, foods, or music to their adopted kingdoms, sometimes wildly popular, sometimes suspiciously labeled exotic or dangerous. One queen caused a scandal simply by eating tomatoes, which some believed were poisonous. She survived. The tomatoes survived. The scandal lasted 3 months. You smile faintly and sit on a cushion. You imagine her here, lonely but determined, isolated but observant, trying to read a culture that stared back at her with equal intensity. She would have learned which nobles to trust, which to avoid, how to pronounce their names, which gestures meant friendship, which meant insult, which conversations she shouldn't join, and which she was expected to lead. Being foreign wasn't a weakness, but it wasn't safe either. You rise and walk into the final chamber, a small sanctuary filled with soft drapes and a woven rug from her homeland. A single cushion sits in the center, its threads worn where she knelt night after night, whispering in the language that kept her roots alive. This room is the beating heart of her identity, the one place she didn't have to pretend. You kneel there, feeling the weight of her journey. Everything around you vibrates with the tension of living in between. Foreign queens survived by adapting, some by embracing their new world, some by reshaping it, some by enduring until time softened hostility. But all of them carried secrets. And in royal life, secrets weren't just burdens, they were armor. And that armor becomes essential in the next stage of survival, because now we enter the place where whispers became weapons. Rumors, reputation, and royal image. You leave the sanctuary of foreign silk and step into a hallway that feels alive in a completely different way, buzzing, electric, restless. The air here quivers with the soft hiss of whispers, sliding from ear to ear, like threads pulled through fabric. You can practically taste the rumors before you hear them. They drift down the corridor in waves, carrying the unmistakable scent of trouble, perfume, and someone trying very hard to sound concerned while actually stirring chaos. Welcome to the battleground of reputation, the social weapon royal women face daily. Not swords, not armies, not decrees, whispers. And unlike swords, whispers didn't miss. You move forward slowly, noticing that the architecture shifts again. Niches interrupt the walls every few paces, perfect for two. Courtiers to lean close and exchange a harmless, innocent comment that somehow becomes kingdom-wide news within a day. Mirrors hang at odd angles, ensuring anyone passing can be watched. Curtains drape in pools of velvet, excellent for eavesdropping from behind. This entire corridor feels engineered for gossip, as though the palace built itself around the most powerful force it knew. Human curiosity mixed with pettiness. A mainstream fact floats calmly into place. In nearly every royal court, French, Ottoman, Chinese, Persian, Russian, Ethiopian, English rumors shaped political landscapes more effectively than swords. A queen's image determined her influence. A single damaging whisper could topple alliances, shift succession plans, or spark rebellions. Reputation wasn't just important, it was survival. You pass a pair of carved wooden doors left slightly ajar. Inside, a long salon stretches with plush seating, patterned carpets, and pale light filtering through lattice screens. This is the gossip chamber, the informal court, where noble women gathered for embroidery, reading, music, and the quiet art of character assassination disguised as sharing concerns. You slip inside. The room still holds the ghost of feminine laughter, the rustle of gowns, the clinking of teacups. Ladies in waiting and duchesses once sat in these curved chairs, pretending to mend lace while subtly destroying someone's credibility. She seemed tired at dinner, one might murmur. Perhaps she's unwell, another replies. But she looked perfectly fine last week, a third adds, smiling just enough to weaponize ambiguity. And that, right there, is how a foreign queen becomes possibly ill, then weak, then unfit, then dangerous. Reputation moved fast. A soft, sleepy joke rises. Court gossip moved at the speed of medieval Wi-Fi, unreliable but somehow everywhere at once. You wander deeper until you reach a narrow writing table. On it lies a stack of notes tied with ribbon. Anonymous messages, warnings, compliments, insults disguised as compliments. These were the social currency of the time. Letters slipped into sleeves, left on cushions, misplaced in doorways. A queen who opened the wrong note on the wrong day could suddenly find her name tangled in a rumor so sticky it outlived her. Historians still argue whether certain infamous scandals were real or invented. Did a queen truly host secret nighttime meetings with a foreign ambassador? Or did a jealous noble start the rumor after she wore a dress he didn't like? The lines blur, and the truth becomes smoke. Often, it didn't matter what actually happened, only what people believed. A fringe tidbit tickles your ear. In some courts, rival factions hired professional rumor spreaders, trained to deliver whispers with just the right tone of hesitation. I'm sure it's nothing, but they were influencers before influencers existed. You move down the salon to a tall mirror framed in gilded vines. You see your reflection soften and stretch in its surface. These mirrors weren't placed for vanity, they were surveillance tools. A queen checked her expression here before entering the hall. A tremble could undo her. A careless smirk could suggest arrogance. A moment of sadness could spark concerns about her mental health. Royal women lived inside a perpetual performance. A soft joke drifts in. Imagine trying to control your face 24/7. You'd be exhausted by lunchtime. You step through an inner archway into the image gallery, where portraits line the walls in heavy frames, their eyes following you with mixed judgment. These weren't just artworks, they were marketing. They crafted the Queen's story virtuous, maternal, generous, serene. The portraits conveniently ignored political stress, insomnia, or the fact that half the kingdom was trying to ruin her week. You pause before one portrait, an impossibly serene queen, holding a book. Her painted expression radiates wisdom, grace, calm. Reality? Maybe she spent half her life wrestling with letters from hostile ambassadors. Maybe she argued with the king every day about tax reform. Maybe she cried behind closed doors. But her image? Untarnished. Historians still debate whether portraits reflected personal truth or political necessity. Spoiler: political necessity usually won. You leave the gallery and find yourself in a darker room, scattered with torn letters on the floor. This chamber feels heavier, thicker, as though secrets once burst open here. Scandal lived in these walls. Real scandals, and invented ones. You kneel beside a torn letter. Only one line is legible. She cannot be trusted. Was it true, or was it planted, or whispered, or misunderstood? You'll never know. That's how rumors work. They destroy certainty. They drain stability. They turn queens into caricatures. A fringe fact flickers. Sometimes queens used rumors, strategically, feeding them gently into the wind, to discredit rivals, mislead enemies, or protect themselves. Reputation wasn't just vulnerability, it was a weapon. You stand and step into the final part of the room, an alcove curtained with sheer silk. Inside sits a small wooden box carved with vines and roses. You open it gently. Inside lie objects meant to defend reputation: talismans, prayer beads, fragments of poetry, dried flowers from supporters, hair ribbons from loyal ladies. Tiny reminders that truth existed somewhere, even if it was constantly drowned by whispers. You inhale deeply. The air smells of lavender and old ink. You feel the truth settle in your bones. Royal women didn't survive the palace by being perfect. They survived by managing perception, by knowing who was talking, by knowing who was listening, by knowing when to stay silent. But sometimes, even the best managed image couldn't protect a queen from betrayal, especially betrayal born from money, inheritance, and ambition sharper than any blade. You step toward the next archway, where the air grows heavier and colder. It smells like secrets wrapped in gold. It smells like debt. It smells like danger. It smells like dowries. And inside those dowries, daggers. You step through the archway and instantly feel the air change, not colder, but weighted, like you've walked straight into the breath held between two people who both know something terrible is about to be said. This is the wing of the palace where money whispers louder than any courtier ever could. Not treasure, not jewels. Dowries. Big ones. Silent ones. Dangerous ones. The carpets here are thicker, the drapes softer, the walls covered in embroidered scenes meant to look peaceful but look closer, and you notice every stitched flower hides a tiny gold thread, every dove stitched beside a sword. Welcome to the palace's financial heart, where marriages weren't romances, they were transactions, and where every transaction came with teeth. A mainstream fact settles beside you. In royal courts across Europe, Asia, and Africa, dowries weren't mere wedding gifts. They were political contracts, strategic investments, territorial promises, and sometimes lifelong traps. A queen arrived not as a bride, but as a package deal, trailing land, armies, debts, and enemies behind her like a silk train. You walk forward until you reach a long table overflowing with parchment scrolls tied in coloured ribbon. These are dowry contracts, some warm with promise, others brittle with tension. You pick one up. The wax seal has cracked, but the ink still shouts in looping letters. 5 provinces pledged, 10,000 silver in annual payment. Succession terms to be negotiated. A marriage? No. This is foreign policy dressed in lace. A soft, sleepy joke drifts in. You realize medieval romance basically sounded like, "I love you, and also your strategically valuable port city." You continue deeper into the chamber, where chests stand stacked in rows, carved, gilded, reinforced with iron. Some are open, revealing embroidered fabrics, jewels, silver candlesticks, ornate knives. The knives gleam sharper than you expect. You lean closer. These weren't meant for cooking. These were ceremonial daggers included in dowry gifts, symbols of loyalty, lineage, and the deeply unspoken truth. Marriage could cut both ways. A fringe tidbit nudges your thoughts. In some courts, a bride's family sent a dagger with the dowry to symbolize her new alliance. In others, the dagger reminded the groom's family that mistreating the bride could bring consequences. Subtlety wasn't always the medieval strong suit. You move to another corner where letters lie scattered. These are more personal scribbled notes from queens to their relatives back home. They say the dowry payment is late. The king's advisors question the land borders again. My husband's cousin believes my marriage has cost him his inheritance. Every line trembles with the tension of a woman caught between two families, one that sent her and one that didn't quite trust her. Historians still argue whether dowries strengthened or endangered royal women. Some say they gave queens leverage. Others say they made queens' targets living reminders of debts unpaid or promises too heavy for a single throne. You step into a smaller chamber filled with ledgers. A clerk once sat here tallying what the queen brought and what she supposedly owed. Dowries were never simple. If the money wasn't paid on time, scandal. If the land was contested, war. If the family struggled to keep up with payments, guess who got blamed? Not the king, certainly, the queen. You notice a ledger open to a page reading 3 years unpaid. Queen to be publicly reprimanded. Imagine being publicly scolded for your parents' overdue invoice. A soft joke floats in. Royal dowries were basically very high-stakes subscription services, except cancelling them started actual wars. You leave the ledgers and follow the corridor into a grand hall. Here, the ceiling rises high enough to swallow voices. This was the negotiation chamber, where envoys argued over dowry clauses, while queens pretended to be demurely uninterested when, in reality, their futures were being drafted like financial treaties. You walk along the table, imagining heated debates rising like storm winds. She brings too little land. She brings too much influence. She brings no heirs yet. She brings too many relatives. Every argument used the queen as a pawn, even though she was the one who'd bleed if the negotiations went wrong. Historians still debate one famous dowry dispute where the queen nearly lost her position because her father reneged on a promised sum. Some say she intervened diplomatically and saved her status. Others claim the king spared her out of affection. Others insist politics forced mercy. The truth is probably a messy blend, like most royal stories. You move on. The final room of this wing is dimmer, quieter, and strangely intimate. A single trunk sits in the center, open, half-packed. You feel a chill creep down your spine. This is where queens, prepared for their darkest outcome, being returned. If a dowry went wrong, if alliances shattered, if the marriage soured beyond repair, a queen could be sent back to her birth family. Like merchandise returned with a polite but devastating note. Not as expected. Please advise. You kneel beside the trunk. Inside lie the personal objects a queen might take. Hair ribbons, childhood letters, keepsakes. But next to them sits a parchment stamped with a cold message. Dissolution pending. You inhale slowly. It's not just a breakup. It's national humiliation. A fringe fact whispers from the shadows. Some queens fought this fate fiercely, calling upon allies, stirring political support, even staging symbolic fasts or public appearances to rally sympathy. Some won, some didn't. You stand slowly. Dowries weren't gifts, they were leverage. They bought safety, power, enemies, expectations, and the thin line between belonging and being discarded. Every royal woman lived with that knife-edge pressure. Every royal woman understood that betrayal often came not with violence, but with account books. And yet, many found ways to survive, to navigate, to fight, to carve out small victories that never made it into chronicles, which is where your path leads next, into the quiet brilliance of those survival strategies. Small gestures, hidden wins, soft triumphs that outlasted every scandal. You step away from the heavy air of dowry politics and move into a softer corridor, narrower, warmer, lit by gentle lamps instead of torches. The palace feels quieter here, as though it understands you've just survived the sharp edges of wealth and betrayal, and now need a hallway where the walls breathe with you instead of against you. This is where the victories lived, not the grand ones bards sang about, but the small, stubborn triumphs royal women carved out of impossible circumstances. The stone under your feet feels smoother, worn not by ceremonies but by private. Footsteps, late-night pacing, shared secrets, stolen moments of relief. A lighter scent floats in the air here. Beeswax, faint jasmine, and the unmistakable warmth of candle drippings. You feel it instantly. This is the wing where royal women fought not with daggers or alliances, but with patience, timing, and that quiet resilience most chroniclers forgot to record. A mainstream fact slips gently into place. While history loves its big turning points, coronations, wars, treaties, it was often the small, invisible decisions made by royal women that shaped the palace's daily survival. They didn't overthrow kingdoms, usually. They didn't command armies publicly. But they steered negotiations through a comment at dinner, softened political tension with a timely gift, preserved domestic peace through a strategically planned festival, or saved lives by sending a single warning to the right person at the right hour. You step into a cozy chamber glowing with firelight. The room is small enough that your footsteps barely echo. A round table sits in the center, scattered with embroidery hoops, wax seals, small coins, handwritten notes, dried flower petals. These weren't political tools, but they were tools of subtle strategy. You pick up a folded piece of parchment. Inside is a short message. He seemed troubled today. Send the musicians into the East Hall at dusk. A trivial sentence. But maybe that music soothed an argument, distracted an angry king, prevented an impulsive decree that would have ruined a noble family. History rarely records the absence of mistakes, yet many royal women spent their lives preventing precisely those disasters. A soft, sleepy joke drifts in. The entire kingdom owes half of its stability to queens quietly managing royal meltdowns no one else was equipped to handle. You move toward a cushioned window seat. The sunlight streaming in is warm, golden, calm. You sit and feel the softness beneath you, imagining a royal woman, curled here years ago, mending a tear in a child's tunic, writing a thank you note to a sympathetic lord, practicing a conversation that needed exactly the right softness to land properly. These little things kept her alive, and sometimes kept her powerful. Historians still argue whether subtle influence counts as true political power. Some dismiss these quiet victories as incidental. Others insist they were the invisible scaffolding that held entire dynasties together. You suspect the truth leans toward, she saved the kingdom again, but sure, let's pretend she was just good at sewing. You rise and wander deeper into the chamber, where a decorative screen hides a corner filled with personal objects, trinkets, small hand-carved toys, an ink bottle, a comb, a bundle of dried herbs. Royal women exchange tiny gifts like these constantly. A comb given to a chambermaid might secure her loyalty. A dried herb sachet sent to a noblewoman could communicate alliance. A handwritten poem slipped to a frightened young girl might give her courage to survive her first court gathering. A fringe tidbit arrives gently. In one famous court, a queen kept a favor ledger, a small book where she recorded every kindness she received and every kindness she gave, not to calculate debt, but to make sure no one ever felt forgotten. That book, reportedly, prevented more political feuds than any treaty the king ever signed. You continue forward and enter a quiet room lined with shelves, not full of books, full of little containers, silk pouches, wooden boxes, folded linens, each one labeled with a person's name. These were the Queen's emergency kits, notes to deliver in crises, tokens of reassurance, small savings to distribute secretly when someone lost everything. She couldn't rewrite laws, but she could prevent a loyal servant from starving. She couldn't command soldiers, but she could send a letter that kept a young cousin from being arrested. Soft victory after soft victory. Invisible, but real. A soft joke flickers. If modern productivity apps existed back then, queens would have mastered kingdom management through color-coded emotional labor. You move into the final chamber of this wing, a small retreat filled with cushions and a single wooden writing desk facing a window. Papers lie here too, but these feel different. Their ink is softer, their handwriting more contemplative. These are personal notes, reflections, prayers, quiet declarations of gratitude, simple joys recorded in ink, as though joy itself needed proof. You unfold one and read the first line. Today he laughed for the first time in months. A moment too small for official records. A moment that meant everything to her. Another note reads, "The council listened today. Not fully, but enough." Another. She smiled again when she saw the garden. These were victories that didn't shake continents, but they steadied hearts. And steady hearts created steady courts. Historians still debate whether these small acts should count in the official story of royal influence. But as you stand in this warm room, surrounded by the gentle residue of resilience, you understand. Survival isn't grand, it's persistent, it's quiet, it's careful, it's human. Royal women didn't always win the big wars, but they won the daily battles that kept them and sometimes entire kingdoms alive. And now, with those soft victories echoing behind you, you move toward the next corridor. A corridor filled with babies, some heirs, some pawns, some threats, some salvation. Because now you enter the chapter where children change everything. You leave the chamber of soft victories and step into a hallway painted with pale morning light, the kind of light that washes everything clean for a moment before the world remembers its troubles. The air feels warmer here, tinged with the faint scent of milk, honeyed porridge, and linen dried in sunlight, and you know instantly. This is the corridor where the palace stops pretending to be made of stone and starts feeling like it's made of heartbeat. Children, tiny heirs with enormous destinies, infants who caused kingdoms to tremble, little daughters whose futures were written before they could speak, sons who represented safety, danger, or both, depending on who stood to gain. You move slowly, your steps naturally softening. A mainstream fact glides gently into your thoughts. Across royal courts everywhere, children weren't just family, they were symbols, tools, bargaining chips. Living answers to political prayers, and sometimes the triggers for political nightmares. A baby could make a faction rise or fall. A toddler stumbling through the Great Hall could shift foreign policy. A teenage prince might spark a civil war simply by being born in the wrong birth order. You reach a doorway draped with embroidered curtains, lions, cranes, lilies, dragons stitched together as if every kingdom represented by the child wanted their influence recorded. You gently push the curtain aside. Inside is the royal nursery. The air hums with a quiet, cozy warmth, and tiny dust motes float like drifting stars. Cradles line the walls carved from oak, cedar, sandalwood, each a gift from a different relative hoping to win favor. One cradle is painted sky blue with silver moons. Another is wrapped in soft wool blankets. Another still has a protective charm tied around its side against illness, against jealousy, against fate. A soft, sleep-friendly joke curls in. Royal nurseries basically looked like ancient Etsy stores curated by 20 ambitious duchesses. You walk toward the largest cradle in the center, the heir's cradle. He or she, depending on the kingdom's succession laws, slept here under the approving or terrified eyes of the entire court. You trail your fingers along the rim. It feels warm even now, as if memory clings to the wood. The queen would have stood, here countless nights, rocking gently, humming under her breath, knowing a dozen noble families were placing bets on the child's first sneeze. Historians still argue whether royal mothers truly bonded deeply with their children, given that many were raised by wet nurses, tutors, and governesses. But diaries, letters, and worn little toys say otherwise. Queens loved fiercely, sometimes desperately, because loving a royal child meant loving someone the world could take from them at any moment. You move toward a small table, cluttered with treasures. Carved rattles, teething rings made of polished bone, tiny shoes no longer than your palm. One toy catches your eye, a little wooden horse with wheels. The paint has faded, but one side still shows little fingerprints pressed into the wood. Children see no crowns, no duty, no danger, just toys. A fringe tidbit floats in softly. Some royal babies had entire astrologers' councils predict their futures on the night they were born. If the stars claimed the child was destined for greatness celebrations. If the stars predicted doom panic, reassignments, maybe a discreet effort to reinterpret the stars. You continue into a sun-filled room where a row of chairs faces a long table stacked with children's books, picture manuscripts with illustrated beasts, fables written in ornate scripts, moral lessons disguised as animal stories. Here, tutors instructed children in language, religion, philosophy, etiquette. A prince learned how to hold a sword correctly before he learned how to hold a spoon. A princess learned how to negotiate without appearing to negotiate at all. A soft joke lifts the corner of your thoughts. Imagine your bedtime story being the political consequences of disappointing your future regents. You wander toward the window and notice a small garden below high-walled, safe, filled with soft grass. This was where royal children played under the watchful eyes of attendants. Their laughter, once echoed here, mingling with birdsong and the rustle of guards who pretended not to smile. A child's joy softened even the sternest palace walls, at least for a moment. Yet beneath the innocence, the stakes were enormous. A son could secure a dynasty, a daughter could secure an alliance, a second son could topple everything simply by existing. Children brought hope and vulnerability in equal measure. Historians still debate one particular prince, whether his mother pushed him politically or whether factions used him without her knowledge. He became a rallying point for rebellion. She became the scapegoat. The truth, as usual, is fog. You walk into a quieter chamber, smaller, dimmer. This is where truth lived. A rocking chair sits beside a low crib. A single blanket folded neatly. This room wasn't for politics. It was for late-night tears. whispered lullabies, and queens clutching their children tightly, knowing that affection is dangerous in a court where everyone wants a piece of the air. Another handwritten note lies on the floor. You pick it up with care. He took his first steps today. I was not there. The ink wavers slightly. Heartbroken. Royal children were raised by professionals, nannies, governesses, tutors. The Queen often spent her days managing politics, alliances, image, expectations. Love was abundant, but time was rationed. A fringe fact whispers, some queens disguised themselves as attendants to slip into the nursery unnoticed, just to watch their children sleep without an audience. You feel a heaviness in the air now, not sadness exactly, but the enormity of responsibility. Children changed everything for royal women. They gave purpose, they gave strength, they gave leverage, they gave danger. And one day, those children grew up. Some became kings, some became rivals, some became threats, some became strangers. And sometimes, the very children a queen protected became weapons used against her. Because next, you're walking straight into rebellion, the collapse of everything she tried to hold together. You step away from the nursery's soft glow and into a corridor where the air feels tighter, thinner, like it's been pulled taut between too many secrets. The sound changes too. Gone are the warm echoes of children's laughter. Here, your footsteps fall into a heavy silence, the kind reserved for places where the future once cracked open underfoot. This is the wing of rebellions, downfalls, and final gambles, the place where everything a royal woman built can crumble in a moment, and where survival becomes an art sharper than any blade. The stone beneath your feet feels colder. The torches burn lower. Even the shadows seem angled, differently edged, restless, braced. It's as if the palace itself remembers the nights when shouts erupted in distant courtyards, when banners were torn from towers, when doors shook beneath fists demanding answers. And in every royal uprising, every conspiracy, every shift of loyalty, there was always one constant. A woman caught in the middle, choosing between loyalty, survival, her children, and her own fragile heart. A mainstream fact slides into place. Across countless kingdoms, English, Chinese, Mughal, Ethiopian, French royal rebellions were rarely just sons against fathers or nobles against kings. They were entire storms shaped by mothers, stepmothers, dowagers, regents, mistresses, foreign queens, and ambitious princesses. Sometimes these women fueled rebellions. Sometimes they prevented them. Sometimes they tried to stop them and were swallowed by them anyway. You reach a tall door carved with curling patterns, heavy as regret. You push it open slowly. Inside is a war council chamber, long table, scattered maps, iron candle holders, chairs knocked slightly askew as if someone once fled this room during a crisis. You walk between the chairs and sense the ghosts of argument still clinging to the air. He sides with his mother. She manipulates him. The young prince listens only to her. She must be removed before he declares himself. Is she planning a coup? Historians still argue whether certain queens genuinely influenced rebellions or were simply convenient targets for blame. Many royal sons accused their mothers of holding too much power. Many councils accused dowager queens of plotting. Many revolts blamed foreign queens for misguiding kings. Reality? Often far more complex than fragile male pride like to allow. A soft, sleepy joke drifts in. If royal mothers had been half as powerful as the men claimed, half the rebellions wouldn't have happened in the first place. You move toward the table, where a map lies open, territories marked in ink, tiny metal tokens representing armies, castles, factions. One token lies tipped over an heir's token, perhaps pushed down during a heated debate. You imagine the queen standing in that exact spot, trying to steady her voice, while men twice her age argued over her son's future like he was a volatile piece of furniture. You leave the chamber and follow a narrow hallway leading downward, spiraling stone steps that feel damp with old fear. This is where rebellions were first heard before anyone admitted them were happening. A rumor from a distant province, a letter delivered too late, a guard overhearing a whispered plan. You descend into a room filled with dusty scrolls secured by twine, warnings, reports, betrayals. A letter lies open, the ink smudged. The young prince has gathered men loyal to him. They whisper of independence. A queen reading this would feel her heart shatter, not because rebellion threatened the king, but because rebellion threatened her child. Royal motherhood wasn't cozy. It was a battlefield. You continue deeper until you reach a chamber lit by a single lantern. Inside are the tools of desperate strategy disguises, travel cloaks, sealed documents granting safe passage, tiny chests containing emergency funds. Royal women often prepared for rebellion long before anyone acknowledged it was coming. They weren't prophets. They were observers. They saw wars rising in how men shifted in their chairs, how courtiers exchanged glances, how a prince's eyes hardened over months. A fringe tidbit flickers in. One queen had escape routes built into her private chambers, hidden passages disguised as storage alcoves, so she could flee if rebels stormed the palace. Historians still debate whether she ever used them or merely enjoyed the psychological comfort of knowing she could. You leave the room and take another passage upward until you emerge into a larger hall, where shattered pottery still sits in corners. Someone once threw these, maybe in rage, maybe in grief, maybe in both. This hall witnessed final confrontations, sons accusing mothers of treachery, queens pleading with husbands to reconsider fatal decisions, dowagers trying to hold the kingdom together while rivals pulled it apart. You step toward a raised platform, a throne dais. The throne is absent now, moved long ago, but the outline on the floor remains. A queen might have stood here during her last attempt to reason with a crumbling court. She would have spoken calmly even as her world fractured beneath her. Historians still argue whether one famous queen's last speech prevented a civil war or merely delayed it. Either way, her voice carried enough weight that even her enemies paused to listen. A soft joke surfaces gently. Courtmen dismissed queens until things fell apart, then immediately asked, "What do we do now?" You walk toward a broken doorway leading to a balcony where the night wind races through. You step outside. Below, you see the outer walls of the palace. Once, banners would have flown here, royal crests, rebellion flags, symbols of triumph, symbols of defeat. And on nights like those, a queen might have stood exactly where you stand now, clutching the railing, watching torches moving in the distance like angry fireflies. She would have known that everything was about to change. Rebellions broke kingdoms. They broke families. They broke women most of all. But some found their final courage in those moments. They made desperate bargains, sent secret messages, smuggled their children out, protected who they could. They gambled everything on love, loyalty, or survival. Some won, some didn't, all were changed. You step back inside. The corridor ahead feels softer, dimmer. Lavender drifts faintly in the air again. The end of this journey approaches, and now you walk into the last chapter legacy, written gently in the smoke of candles burning low. You walk slowly into the final corridor of the palace, a long, quiet stretch where the air feels softer than anywhere you've been before. The light here is warm, golden, almost hazy, like sunlight filtered through thin silk. The echoes fade, the tension fades, even the shadows seem gentler. This is where the noise of politics finally settles into a hush. This is where legacy lives. Not the grand kind etched in marble or shouted in royal decrees. The softer kind. The kind written in candle smoke. You take another step, and your footfalls seem to blend with centuries of footsteps from women whose lives were spent balancing danger and grace. Queens whose names you know. Queens whose names history forgot. Mothers, daughters, mistresses, rivals, widows, survivors. Every one of them leaving an imprint on the palace, even when no one carved it into stone. A mainstream fact drifts in like a feather. In many courts across the world, chroniclers downplayed or erased the contributions of royal women. Their decisions were credited to kings, their strategies attributed to councils, their sacrifices dismissed as circumstance. And yet, the deeper you look, the more you see the fingerprints they left everywhere on alliances, on customs, on the very rhythm of palace life. You pass by a wall lined with their faded frescoes. Time has blurred the colors, but you can still make out women in flowing robes, hands resting on scrolls, children, books, musical instruments. They don't wield swords. They don't sit on thrones. But their presence radiates influence, quiet, persistent, undeniable. A soft, sleepy joke stirs. History books really said, a mysterious shift in policy happened here, as if a queen didn't spend 6 months gently coaching the king into a better idea. You turn a corner and step into a small room bathed in candlelight. This chamber feels almost sacred. Little objects rest on a table, lockets, letters, carved wooden charms, half-burnt candles. These are the offerings of memory, tiny pieces of the women who walked before you. You pick up a locket carved with roses, open it, and find a miniature portrait inside a queen with dark eyes and a smile that knows more than she lets on. No artist could capture her whole story. Only the palace walls remember the rest. Historians still argue whether legacy is shaped by what a queen did publicly or by what she endured privately. Whether her storytelling mattered more than her diplomacy. Whether her survival mattered more than her triumphs. It's strange, isn't it? How the quietest acts sometimes echo the longest. You walk deeper into the chamber and find shelves lined with scrolls, not official records, but personal writings. Diaries, poems, letters to sisters, notes to friends, scribbled lines in moments of doubt or hope. Royal women, denied the right to speak loudly in life, left truth in their handwriting. You unfurl one and read a single soft sentence. They will never know the real story, but I do. It catches in your chest. Because that is legacy too, knowing your own truth, even when the world chooses a different version of you. A fringe tidbit whispers from the walls. Some queens intentionally wrote false diaries, knowing historians would read them. An act of rebellion, an act of protection, or an act of mischief. Honestly, all three feel equally iconic. You leave the room and enter the final hall. It stretches forward like a long, low exhale. Candles flicker along both sides, their flames swaying in slow, sleepy arcs. Their smoke curls softly upward, painting invisible patterns in the air. You feel it the way stories linger even after the storyteller is gone. Royal women lived through crisis after crisis, betrayals, alliances, childbirth dangers, political storms, foreign courts, hostile gossip, dowry traps, rebellions. Some won, some lost, but all of them survived long enough to leave something behind. A shift in policy, a change in fashion, a protected child, a saved life, a rewritten tradition, a softened king, a strengthened kingdom, a whispered lesson to a young girl who would grow up remembering it. Their legacies weren't always loud, but they were real, and they shaped the world in more ways than history admits. You stand at the end of the hall, feeling every step of the journey settle gently around you, like hands resting on your shoulders, steady and warm. The palace exhales. You exhale, and the stories of royal women, messy, flawed, brilliant, afraid, triumphant, linger like the final glow of a candle before sleep. And now, the palace grows quieter still. The torches burn lower, their flames shrinking into soft, golden pearls of light. The last echoes fade from the halls, as though gently swept into corners where they can rest undisturbed. You walk slowly, not because you must, but because your body naturally welcomes the slower rhythm. The stone beneath you feels warmer now, softened by memory and by the hush that settles when stories come to their end. The air moves around you in long, unhurried currents. Every breath you take feels deeper, fuller, easier. The palace that once hummed with tension now cradles you in something gentler, like drifting candle smoke curling upward into the dim rafters before dissolving into the dark. You pause at a window, where night presses softly against the glass. The stars above hang low and steady, as though they've been listening along with you, patient and unblinking. Their quiet glow spreads through you, loosening whatever tightness lingered in your shoulders. You let the calm settle, let the world slow, let the last remnants of the day melt into the stillness. Behind you, the stories of royal women rest like closed books, quiet but alive, waiting for whoever needs them next. Ahead of you, only softness remains, only stillness, only the gentle, rhythmic lull that arrives when imagination and sleep begin to blur together. Your steps become lighter, your breathing longer, your mind softer at the edges, and with one final glance down the lantern-lit corridor, you ease into the quiet night, carrying the calm with you like a warm cloak wrapped around your shoulders. Sleep well, rest deeply, let the palace fade behind your closed eyes.